Captain Pierce stood before the transmission screen with her hands steady and her voice calm. The red light blinked, showing that every word she spoke would travel across the galaxy to the Galactic Council chamber. She had prepared for this moment for 3 months, and now the time had come to speak the words that would change everything. Behind her in the command center of Earth's orbital station, technicians worked without making any sound. They knew what was at stake. The message was about to send would either save the galaxy or condemn it. There was no middle ground. Took a breath and began to speak. She explained to the Galactic Council that Earth scientists had made a discovery near the edge of the nebula. An ancient weapon lay dormant in space, built by a civilization that had disappeared millions of years ago. This weapon could destroy entire star systems with a single activation. It was not a small bomb or a powerful gun. It was something far worse. It was a doomsday device. She told them the facts clearly. The weapon responded only to human biology. Only people with human DNA could access its control systems. This meant humans were the only ones in the galaxy who could stop it if someone tried to activate it by mistake. She stressed this point many times. The weapon could not be moved. It could not be studied. It could not be touched. His face remained serious as she delivered the most important part of the message. If anyone tried to drill into the weapon, if anyone attempted to take it from its resting place, if anyone tried to figure out how it worked, the device would activate its protocol. When that happened, every living thing within 100 light-years would die. She said this simple truth without any emotion in her voice. The numbers were too large to feel anything about them. She told the Council that Earth was sharing this information out of respect for all living things. Humanity was still young among the stars, but they understood their responsibility. They had found something dangerous and they had to warn everyone. Do not send ships to the nebula. Do not study the weapon. Do not try to move it. Leave it where it sleeps. This was the message. This was what mattered. When finished speaking, she looked directly into the camera. In the chamber on the Galactic Council's space station, billions of kilometers away, the ancient leaders of the 3 great civilizations would see her face. They would make their decision based on her words and the data her people had gathered. The transmission ended. The red light went dark. The message had been sent. Turned away from the screen and walked to the window that looked out at Earth below. The planet was blue and green and brown, turning slowly in the darkness of space. Her home. The world that had sent her to warn the galaxy. Commander Jack Hayes entered the command center. He was a tall man with streaking his dark hair. He had spent 40 years in Earth's military and had seen conflicts that taught him one simple truth. When someone warned you about danger, you needed to listen. But he also knew another truth. People often did not listen until it was too late. "Message transmitted, Captain," he said, standing next to at the window. "Yes," replied. "Now we wait to see if anyone believes us." Jack put his hand on her shoulder. He did not need to say anything. They both understood what was coming. Back in the Galactic Council chamber, the 3 leaders listened to Swarning. And of the High Collective was the first to speak. He was a being of pure intelligence, his mind running faster than any human could imagine. But intelligence did not always mean wisdom. He dismissed the warning as the fearful words of a young species trying to establish authority in the galaxy. Earth was primitive. Earth had space stations, but only recently. Earth had built weapons, but they were weak compared to the great powers. Why should the Council listen to warnings from such a young civilization? The Dominion's leader, Empress, was more careful. She ordered her scientists to review Earth's data, but the data was strange and difficult to understand. It came from human observations and human machines, that preferred to gather their own intelligence. They did not trust information gathered by others, especially not by humans. The Syndicate's representative, General, saw only opportunity. If a weapon existed, it could be claimed. It could be studied. It could be weaponized. They did not fear anything. They had conquered dozens of star systems. They had technology that made other civilizations look like children. A warning from humans? This was an insult. After one day of debate, the Galactic Council made their decision. They voted to ignore Earth's warning. They voted to send an expeditionary fleet to the nebula. They voted to claim the weapon and bring it under their control. The message from Earth was filed away as a footnote in the Council records, something to be remembered only if everything went wrong. Back on the orbital station received the Council's response. No words of thanks, no promises to stay away, just a simple announcement that they would send a fleet. They would send scientists and soldiers. They would study the weapon and add it to the galaxy's arsenal of power. Closed her eyes for a moment. She had tried. She had sent the warning as clearly and as honestly as possible. She had told them the truth, but the truth was not enough. The warning had been delivered and it had been rejected. The drilling began at dawn. From the perspective of space, the word dawn meant nothing. There was no sun near the nebula, only the glow of dying stars and the radiation of old cosmic events. But the teams on the expedition vessel called it dawn because it marked the beginning of their greatest achievement. They believed they were about to unlock the secrets of a god-level civilization. Dr. Foster watched from the observation platform as the mechanical drills pushed through the weapon's outer layers. She was part of the scientific team, though she came from a smaller research station, not the main civilization. Was one of the few who had read Earth's full warning message. She had studied the data. She had seen the mathematical models that showed what would happen if the weapon was activated. She had raised her concerns to her superiors. No one listened. The drills continued their work. The weapon was ancient beyond measure, but its exterior shell was only metal and crystal compounds. The technology made short work of it. Within hours, they had created an opening large enough for teams to enter and begin their study. Sent one more message to the command center. She asked them to stop. She told them that Earth had been very clear in the warning. She said that activating the weapon was exactly what they should not do. Her message was logged and filed away. The drilling continued. The first sign of trouble came as a vibration. It started small, like the hum of an engine powering up. Then it grew stronger. Scientists on the expedition ship began running from their stations to their monitoring screens. Stomach tightened. She knew this feeling. This was the feeling of something very bad beginning to happen. In the depths of the weapon, ancient systems were coming alive. The device had been in sleep mode for millions of years, waiting. It did not care who had drilled into it. It did not care why they had come. It only knew that it had been disturbed, that someone had broken its protective seal, that someone had triggered the protocols. The weapon began to calculate. It began to move energy through pathways that had not been used since the civilization that built it had ceased to exist. Power started flowing from the quantum core at the weapons center. The device recognized that it had been accessed without authorization. It recognized that the genetic lock had been bypassed by force, not by the proper biological key. Therefore, it would execute its final protocol. It would destroy the disturbance. The drills stopped moving. For a moment, there was silence in the command center. Then alarms began to sound. Not the gentle warning sounds that ships used for minor problems. These were the alarms that meant the end was coming. Ran to the nearest control panel and pulled up the weapon's internal scans. What she saw made her blood go cold. The device was powering up at an exponential rate. The core was reaching temperature levels that should not exist outside of a star's interior. The radiation levels were climbing beyond every measurement scale they had. She grabbed the communication channel that connected directly to the expedition fleet. She screamed warnings at the pilots. She told them to run, to leave, to get as far away as possible. But even as she spoke, she knew it was too late. Nothing could move faster than energy. Nothing could outrun a weapon that was already calculating its destruction. The weapon released its power in a wave that moved outward in all directions at once. Where it touched space, space itself changed. The expedition vessel was caught directly in the blast. The ship simply ceased to exist, not in pieces, not broken apart. It simply stopped being, converted into energy and radiation that fed the expanding wave of destruction. The wave continued outward. It reached toward the home system. The distance was 40 light seconds away, but the weapon's power knew no such boundaries. It burned through space like fire through dry wood. When it reached the inhabited planets, entire continents were vaporized in moments. 12 million civilians, soldiers, families, and children were gone, not dead in the traditional sense, erased from existence as if they had never been. But the weapon was not finished. It had been created to destroy on a massive scale, and it continued its work. The wave reached toward the colonies. They had powerful shields and advanced defensive systems, but they were designed to stop enemy ships, not to stop the release of ancient godlike weapons. Entire worlds darkened as the destruction reached them. The Syndicate's home system felt the wave next. 3 billion soldiers were stationed there, the greatest military force in that region of the galaxy. None of them could do anything to stop what was coming. The weapon systems they had spent centuries building were completely useless. The armor they wore was transparent to the weapon's power. In less than 2 hours, 1/3 of the galaxy's military power was erased. The wave continued to expand, moving outward in a perfect sphere of destruction. Every system it touched, every world it reached, every ship it encountered was converted into nothing. The destruction was not violent or dramatic. It was absolute and complete. The galaxy was simply removing a disease, burning away anything that dared to activate a device they should have left alone. On Earth, watched the data stream in from distant monitoring stations. She saw the numbers climbing. She saw the radiation levels that should not exist in normal space. She saw entire civilizations going dark, their communication networks shutting down as the waves of destruction reached them. Commander Jack stood beside her. He did not need her to explain what was happening. He could read the numbers as well as she could. The Council had ignored the warning. The Council had sent their ships. The Council had tried to access the weapon. And now the weapon was doing exactly what it told them it would do. Jack moved to the weapons console. He began sending orders to every military base on Earth, but not to attack anyone. Earth's ships were already in motion, heading toward the nebula. They were not going to fight. They were going to do what humans had to do. They were going to try to save the emergency council met in the underground bunker beneath Earth's main command center. The room was old, built during the 20th century when humans thought nuclear war would end their civilization. Now, in the 23rd century, it would be used for something else. It would be the place where humanity decided whether to save the galaxy or let it burn. Commander Jack Hayes sat at the head of the table. Next to him was Captain Pierce, still holding the weight of being the person who had warned everyone. Around the table sat Earth's leaders, the President of the North American Union, the Chancellor of the European Federation, the Premier of the Asian Coalition, military generals, scientists, representatives from every human government on Earth and on the colonies spread across the nearby star systems. Jack spoke first. He explained what they already knew. The weapon was expanding its destruction. Every hour, more star systems fell dark. The Galactic Council was in complete chaos. Some of their ships were trying to evacuate civilians. Others were trying to flee and save themselves. Most were simply being consumed by the expanding wave of destruction. The question before them was simple but terrible. Would humanity help? Would they send a team to try to shut down the weapon? Or would they seal their borders and hope that the destruction would not reach Earth in time? If they helped, humans would die. That was certain. The team sent to the weapon would be going into one of the most hostile environments that humans had ever encountered. They would be facing radiation levels that would cook a human body instantly. They would be dealing with ancient technology that no human fully understood. They would be operating under a time limit, knowing that if they failed, their home world would be destroyed. General stood up. He was in charge of Earth's military operations. He argued that helping the galaxy was not Earth's responsibility. The Galactic Council had refused to listen. They had chosen to ignore the warning. That choice had consequences. Why should humans sacrifice their lives for civilizations that had treated them with disrespect? It was a fair argument. It was an honest argument. Several of the leaders in the room nodded in agreement. Saving themselves made sense. Protecting their own people made sense. Letting the galaxy face the consequences of its arrogance made sense. Then spoke. She stood slowly, and the entire room fell silent. Everyone knew she had been right about the weapon. Everyone knew she had tried to warn them. Now she was about to tell them what they should do. Said that humanity had always been defined by sacrifice. She spoke about the ancient wars on Earth, when humans died to save strangers. She talked about the early space program, when humans were willing to risk everything to explore the unknown. She reminded them that they had always been the species that was willing to give everything for a chance to make things better. She said something that no one in the room would forget. She said that this was humanity's moment. This was when the galaxy would learn who humans truly were, not a young species to be dismissed, not a primitive civilization to be ignored, but a people who would walk into hell itself to save those who had scorned them. That was what it meant to be human. That was what set humanity apart. The room was completely silent when finished speaking. Then the President of the North American Union stood up. She said that was right. Earth would send a team. Earth would try to stop the weapon. It was not about saving the Council or proving something to the galaxy. It was about being true to what humans believed in their hearts. One by one, every leader in the room stood. The decision was made. Humanity would send their best people to face the weapon. They would try to save the galaxy, even if it cost them everything. Within the hour, the call went out across Earth and the human colonies. Volunteers were needed. The mission was suicide. No one who went would likely come back alive. The message was simple and honest. Anyone willing to die for this cause should report to the nearest military base. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of people showed up. Some were soldiers, some were scientists, some were ordinary people who simply believed that was right, that this was what humanity was supposed to do. The commanders had to turn most of them away. Only a few could go. The ship could only carry so many people, and only the best would have a chance of surviving. Lieutenant Colonel David Cooper was the first one chosen. He was decorated soldier with 20 years of experience in the military. He had survived more dangerous situations than most humans would ever face. But more importantly, David had something that no training could teach. He had a quality that made soldiers follow him into impossible places. He had the kind of courage that inspired others to be brave. Dr. Green was chosen next. He was Earth's leading expert in astrophysics and advanced stellar engineering. His mind could understand the ancient technology in ways that no one else could. He was nervous about the mission, but he understood that this was his purpose. This was what his entire life of study had been leading toward. Doctor completed the core team. She was a bioengineer, an expert in genetic systems and biological technology. The weapon responded to human DNA, understood the genetic code better than anyone on Earth. If anyone could make the weapon respond to a human command, it would be her. Jack selected 2 additional soldiers to go with them. Together, the team of 5 represented humanity's best hope. They were not warriors going to fight a traditional enemy. They were explorers and scientists going to confront something far older and far more powerful than themselves. The ship that would carry them was called the Columbus. It was the fastest vessel Earth had ever built, but even at top speed, the journey to the nebula would take 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, the team would study everything they could about the weapon. They would prepare themselves for what was coming. They would say goodbye to their families and their friends. David sat in his quarters the night before launch. He held a photograph of his sister's children. He would never see them grow up. He would never know if his sacrifice had actually saved the world or if he would die in the nebula along with billions of others. But he was at peace with his choice. He was the Columbus approached the nebula 3 weeks later. The ship's sensors were screaming warnings. The radiation levels were beyond anything the instruments had been designed to measure. The energy that radiated from the weapon was so intense that the background of space itself seemed to glow with a sick yellow light. David Cooper stood on the observation deck and looked out at what they were about to enter. The weapon was visible now, a dark shape against the nebula's glow. It did not look like a machine. It did not look like a device built by intelligent beings. It looked like something carved from the night itself, a piece of darkness that had solid form. Radiation poured off it like heat waves from a burning fire. He could feel the fear trying to crawl up his spine, but he forced it down. Fear was a reaction. It was something his body did when it sensed danger. That was normal. That was human. But David had learned long ago that fear and courage were not opposites. Courage was doing what needed to be done, even when you were terrified. And right now, David was terrified. Sat in the science station, running calculations on the weapon's power output. Every number he generated made the situation worse. The weapon was reaching critical mass in 12 hours. When it reached full power, the destruction wave would start expanding again. The destruction was currently being held back because the weapon was still feeding its own systems, still drawing power to keep itself active. But once it reached equilibrium, it would release everything outward. 12 hours. That was the time they had to reach the weapon's control center, interface with the genetic lock, and shut down the device. 12 hours to complete a task that had never been done before in the history of human space exploration. Check the suits they would wear. The protective gear was state-of-the-art, but it was designed for human bodies. The weapon's interior would be a harsh environment that would kill a human in minutes without protection. The suits would extend that to hours, maybe. Enough time to complete the mission if everything went perfectly, but nothing ever went perfectly. David made one final check of the explosives and cutting tools they would carry. If they could not access certain sections of the weapon by using the proper systems, they would have to force their way through. The explosives were powerful enough to break through most materials, but using them inside the weapon risked destabilizing its core systems even further. They would use them only as a last resort. The captain of the Columbus transmitted a message to the planet's surface. The message was simple. The team was going in. Whatever happened next would happen quickly. Earth should prepare for any outcome. The shuttle detached from the Columbus and began its descent into the weapon. Immediately, the instruments began to fail. The radiation was too intense. The electromagnetic interference was too strong. Systems that had worked perfectly in space started to break down. The shuttle's shields held, barely, but David could see the strain registers climbing into the red zone. They landed near the opening that the drilling teams had created. The entrance was a jagged hole in the weapon's exterior. It looked like a wound, a place where something had torn through the device's skin. David and the two soldiers, Captain Robert Hill and Sergeant Lisa, prepared to leave the shuttle. They put on the protective suits. Each suit was a small spacecraft unto itself, sealed completely from the outside environment. They contained internal air supplies, temperature regulation systems, and sensors that would feed real-time information back to the shuttlecraft. The suits were rated for the radiation levels they expected to encounter. Rated for was different from tested under, but it was the best Earth had. The exterior temperature was 300 degrees Celsius. The radiation levels would kill an unprotected human in seconds. The air itself was ionized, hot enough to ignite organic material. This was not an environment. This was hell. This was what happened when ancient weapons released their power. David was the first one to exit the shuttle. He activated the suit's propulsion system and moved across the exposed metal toward the opening. The suit systems compensated for the heat and radiation, but he could feel them working at their limits. Every sensor in the suit was screaming data, warning him that he was walking into an environment that would destroy him if anything failed. He reached the opening and looked inside. The interior of the weapon was a maze of corridors and chambers, tubes that carried energy pulsed with a sickly glow. The walls were covered with some kind of organic material that seemed to be growing, spreading across the inner surfaces. This was not right. Weapons should not have living things inside them. But this was ancient technology from a civilization that had thought in ways that humans could not comprehend. Came next, then, followed by the two soldiers. They gathered at the entrance, 5 humans in protective suits standing in hell. David checked his chronometer. 11 hours and 40 minutes remained. They moved forward into the weapon. The corridors twisted and turned, leading deeper into the structure. Radiation decreased as they moved away from the outer sections, but it only decreased slightly. The weapon was still flooding its systems with power, still feeding energy to its core. The temperature inside was lower than the exterior, but still hot enough that David's suit was working overtime to keep him alive. They encountered the first automated defense system 3 levels down. It was a mechanical structure that had been designed to prevent unauthorized access to certain sections of the weapon. It recognized that they were not what it was expecting. It recognized that they were biological intrusions that needed to be removed. The defense system fired at them with beams of concentrated energy. Robert Hill threw himself in front of, using his body to block the beam. The suit absorbed the damage, but the energy was intense. Robert screamed over the radio and immediately began moving toward a shattered piece of metal that could provide cover. David pulled the high-powered rifle from his shoulder and fired at the defense system. The bullets were standard kinetic weapons, nothing special. But the weapon systems were ancient, not designed to deal with this kind of direct attack. The defense system spun toward David. He fired again, targeting the power conduit that seemed to fuel the device. The defense system exploded not violently but completely. Its systems failed all at once and the machine crashed to the ground. David helped Robert up. The suit showed damage, but it was still holding. Robert was alive, but he had taken a direct hit from an energy weapon. He needed to get out. He needed medical attention. But there was no way out. They had come too deep into the weapon. Going back would take time they did not have. Going forward was the only option. Robert understood this. Despite his pain, he moved forward with the team. They descended deeper. The corridors became more complex. They had to climb through vertical shafts and squeeze through passages that seemed too small for the suits to fit through. Was leading them now, using his understanding of the weapons systems to guide them toward what should be the control center. They were running out of time. The chronometer showed that only 7 hours remained. The weapon's power levels were climbing steadily. They could feel it now, not just see it on the instruments. They could feel the vibration of the ancient device reaching toward the moment when it would release everything and destroy all the surrounding space. Was moving faster than she had been, driven by desperation now. They all were. The fear was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer fear of death. It was fear of failure, fear that they would not make it in time, fear that all of humanity's sacrifice would be for nothing. They reached a sealed door. This was the barrier to the inner sanctum, the protected core where the weapons control systems were located. The door was sealed with a genetic lock. It recognized only the DNA of the beings who had built the weapon, a civilization that had been dead for millions of years. Moved to the lock. She had studied everything they had captured from the weapon's outer systems. She thought she understood how the genetic lock worked. She had brought biological samples with her, human genetic material that might be similar enough to trick the lock into opening. She inserted the sample into the lock. The device analyzed it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door began to slide open. It worked. Human DNA was similar enough to the precursor civilization's genetic code that the lock recognized it as a valid biological key. They entered the control center. The room was vast and filled with systems that glowed with ancient power. At the center was a single interface point. This was where someone could control the weapon. This was what they had come to find. David moved to the interface. He placed his hand on the genetic lock there. The weapon recognized him. The ancient systems activated, responding to the presence of human biology for the first time in millions of years. David's hand remained on the genetic lock. The interface came to life, showing him screens of information in a language that human minds had evolved to understand. The precursor civilization had built their systems in a way that transcended language. They had created visual displays that showed function rather than words. It was simple. It was elegant. It was dangerous. Moved to stand beside David. His mind was already racing through the implications of what he was seeing. The weapon systems were based on principles of physics that humans had only theorized about. The device was not using conventional energy sources. It was drawing power from the quantum field itself, from the basic structure of reality. That was why the destruction could spread so far. It was not constrained by the normal rules of physics. David concentrated on the interface. He was not a scientist. He was a soldier, but soldiers learned how to follow instructions, and these systems seemed to be displaying instructions. The weapon was asking a simple question. What would the operator choose to do? Activate full power? Maintain current status? Shut down the system? David nodded. They both understood what needed to happen. David selected the shutdown option. The weapon did not respond immediately. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then alarms began to sound, not the alarms of the weapon itself. These were warnings from the control system telling them that they had made a critical error. The weapon could not be shut down, not while it was in active status. To shut it down, someone would have to manually deactivate each system, one at a time. The process would take hours. They did not have hours, they had minutes. Was already working on the problem. She had pulled up the secondary systems, looking for any shortcut that might speed up the process. What she found made her blood run cold. The weapon had a within the. If anyone tried to force a shutdown without following the proper procedures, the device would accelerate its activation and release all its power immediately. It was a trap built into a trap. The precursor civilization had anticipated that someone might try to stop their weapon. They had made sure that stopping it was almost impossible. The weapon would either be shut down properly, or it would destroy everything with its full power released instantly. Robert's suit was failing, could see it on her monitoring system. His core temperature was rising. The suit's cooling system had been damaged by the energy blast earlier, and now it was losing the battle against the weapon's heat. He was burning from the inside out, and he knew it. But he was still standing, still watching the others work. David made a decision. He told Robert and Lisa to head back toward the entrance. There was nothing they could do here. Lisa refused to go. She said they had come together and they would either leave together or not at all. Robert understood this. He accepted it. Soldiers understood loyalty. They understood that you did not leave your brothers and sisters behind. Was studying the shutdown sequence. He was looking for a pattern, some way to speed up the process without triggering the system seemed to be asking for confirmations at each step. Confirmations that the operator understood the consequences of what they were doing. Confirmations that the operator was willing to risk everything to stop the weapon. He realized something. The confirmations were not just safeguards. They were part of the shutdown sequence. The precursor civilization had built in a requirement for consciousness, for active choice at each stage. They had wanted to make sure that whoever shut down the weapon truly understood what they were doing. Told David what he had discovered. David placed his hand on the first confirmation prompt. The interface asked him a simple question in visual form. "Are you sure?" David answered yes. The first system began to shut down, not all at once. Carefully, methodically, the ancient device was walking back from its path toward destruction. The vibrations that had been increasing in intensity began to decrease. For the first time since the weapon had been activated, the destruction wave slowed its expansion. But there were 37 more systems to shut down, 37 more confirmations, and the weapon was now fighting back. Its internal systems recognized that they were being deactivated against the device's will. Automated defenses began attacking the control center. More energy beams fired. Lisa moved quickly, tackling out of the way of the first blast. Robert Hill stood firm, using his suit to absorb the incoming energy. His suit's temperature indicator climbed higher. The damage was severe now. His suit would fail in minutes. David kept his hand on the interface. He did not stop. He confirmed the shutdown of system after system. His fingers moved across the genetic lock, each placement triggering the next step in the process. Confirmation. System offline. Confirmation. System offline. Again and again. Was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she watched Robert's condition getting worse. But she did not stop working. She was directing the shutdown sequence, telling David which systems to prioritize. They had to hit the core power regulators next. Without power regulation, the weapon could not function, no matter how many secondary systems were still active. David confirmed the shutdown of the primary power regulators. The weapon shuddered. For a moment, it seemed like everything was going to fail. The internal systems rebelled against the shutdown process. The device actually increased its power output, trying to overload the control interface and destroy it before it could complete the shutdown. Robert Hill collapsed. His suit had finally failed. The internal temperature had reached lethal levels. Lisa was beside him instantly, but there was nothing she could do. Robert had known this was coming. He had known from the moment the energy beam had hit him that this was where his story would end. He had made peace with it. He had chosen to stand and fight until the end. David felt Robert die through the communication system. The feedback went flat. Another human life had ended, another sacrifice made, and David kept working. The weapon was down to 9 systems remaining. The destruction wave outside was now slowing its expansion dramatically. Ships that had been fleeing were beginning to stabilize. Communications from the Galactic Council were coming back online. They knew that something was happening. They could feel the weapon's power diminishing. David confirmed 8 more systems. Each one brought the weapon closer to dormancy. Each one was a victory against the machine that had been designed to destroy everything. The final system remained. This was the core consciousness of the weapon, the central intelligence that had been directing all the other systems. This was what the precursor civilization had called the heart of the device. Shut this down and the weapon would sleep again. Its terrible power would be contained, unable to hurt anyone ever again. David placed his hand on the final confirmation prompt. The interface showed him the consequences of his choice. If he shut down the core consciousness, the weapon would go dormant, but the precursor civilization had built in a backup. The device would activate again in exactly 1,000 years. There was no way to prevent this. The best humanity could do was stop it now and hope that future generations would be prepared when the weapon woke again. David did not hesitate. He confirmed the shutdown. The final system went offline. The weapon became quiet. The vibrations stopped. The radiation levels began to decrease as the quantum field inside the device started to stabilize. The ancient weapon that had been designed to destroy civilizations was now sleeping, content to rest in the nebula for another 1,000 years. Helped David and Lisa move Robert's body back toward the entrance. It took them 2 hours to navigate through the weapon's interior. When they reached the shuttle, they were moving slowly, each of them exhausted beyond measure. The shuttle detached from the weapon and began its ascent back toward the Columbus. As they rose away from the weapon, the sensors showed the destruction wave finally stopping its expansion. The spreading death that had consumed trillions of lives was halting. The galaxy was saved. But the price had been paid. 12 million civilians had died. 30 billion had been destroyed. 40 billion soldiers and civilians had been consumed. And one human soldier, Robert Hill, had given his life inside the weapon itself. David sat in the shuttle and looked at Robert's body. He thought about the choice that had brought them here, the choice to warn the galaxy, the choice to send a team when no one listened, the choice to sacrifice for those who had refused to help themselves. It was what humans did. It was who they were, they sacrificed, they cared. They stood against the darkness even when they knew they might lose. The shuttle docked with the Columbus. The remaining team members transmitted their report back to Earth. The weapon was shut down. The destruction was stopped. Robert Hill was dead, but humanity had saved the galaxy. Commander Jack Hayes stood in Earth's command center and watched the data coming back from the Columbus. He allowed himself one moment of relief, one moment where he could acknowledge that humanity had done what they had set out to do. Then he began sending orders. Ships were dispatched to bring the Columbus home. Medical teams were prepared to receive the survivors. Messages were being drafted to be sent to every civilization in the galaxy. The message was simple. Humanity had done what the Galactic Council could not. Humanity had saved the galaxy. When the Columbus finally arrived back at Earth, 1 billion people stood under the open sky to watch it descend. They watched David Cooper, Green, and walk down the ramp from the shuttle. They watched as Robert Hill's body was carried down in honor. David looked out at the crowd, at all the humans who had believed in what he was doing, at the species that had chosen to save others even when it cost them everything. He thought about Pierce's words. This was what it meant to be human. This was what set humanity apart from every other civilization in the galaxy. The Galactic Council sent a delegation to Earth 2 weeks later. They came to apologize. They came to acknowledge that Earth had been right, that the warning should have been heeded. They came to offer terms of a new treaty that would make humanity equals among the great civilizations of the galaxy. But the most important message came from Foster, the scientist who had tried to warn them before the weapon activated. She had survived by being in a shielded section of the expedition ship. She had made her way back to civilization and had told everyone what Earth had done. She stood before the Galactic Council and demanded that they understand the lesson that had been learned. She said that Earth had saved them not out of a desire for power or recognition. Earth had saved them out of compassion, out of a belief that all life was worth saving, even life that had rejected them. That was humanity. That was what the galaxy needed to remember. From that day forward, humanity's place in the galaxy was secure, not because they had the most powerful weapons, not because they had the most advanced technology, but because they had shown that they were willing to sacrifice everything for those in need. And that, in the end, was stronger than any weapon that had ever been built. The chronometer showed 4 hours remaining. Outside the weapon, the destruction wave was slowing, gathering its strength for the final release. Inside, David, Robert, and Lisa stood before the control systems that could save the galaxy or doom it forever. And he was doing what humans did. He was choosing to save others, even if it cost him his life. The Columbus launched the next morning. As the ship lifted away from Earth, millions of people watched from the ground. They knew what they were sending these 5 people to do. They knew it was likely a death sentence. But they also knew that this was what being human meant. This was the message that Earth was sending to the galaxy. We listen. We care. We are willing to sacrifice everything for those in need. Even for those who had refused to listen when we warned them. E-Galaxy, from the consequences of the Council's arrogance, looked at the predictions on her screen. Based on the expansion rate, the destruction would reach Earth's space in 23 days. That was the time they had. 23 days to stop the weapon, or everyone would die. 23 days, it was not enough time, but it was all they had. Commander Jack moved to the communication console. He began sending orders to every military base on Earth. The war they had hoped to avoid was now inevitable. Not because Earth wanted to fight, but because the galaxy had chosen to ignore the warning, and knew what would happen next. She knew what the Council would find when they reached the weapon. She knew what it would do when they tried to activate it. The countdown had started. The fate of trillions of lives was now in the hands of those who refused to listen.